Sophie had always been an avid explorer of thrift stores, delighting in the discovery of forgotten treasures. One crisp autumn afternoon, she wandered into a quaint shop on the outskirts of town. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays of sunlight filtering through the windows, casting an ethereal glow over the eclectic assortment of antiques. As she meandered through the narrow aisles, her eyes were drawn to a peculiar object, nestled between a vintage gramophone and a stack of leather-bound books. It was an old, hand-carved puppet, its features remarkably lifelike. The puppet's eyes, though made of glass, seemed to hold a depth that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ah, you've found him," the shopkeeper's voice startled Sophie. She turned to see an elderly man with a kindly smile, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Who is he?" Sophie inquired, unable to tear her gaze away from the puppet. "That," the shopkeeper said, "is the puppet collector. A unique piece indeed. Legend has it that he was crafted by a master puppeteer who poured his heart and soul into his creations." Sophie felt an inexplicable connection to the puppet. Without hesitation, she purchased it and brought it home, placing it on a shelf in her living room. That night, as the wind howled outside and the branches of the old oak tree scraped against her window, Sophie was jolted awake by a faint rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened intently. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. Summoning her courage, she crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. As she entered the living room, she froze. The puppet was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it sat on the coffee table, its head tilted slightly, as if observing her. A chill ran down her spine. She distinctly remembered placing the puppet on the shelf. Dismissing it as her imagination, she returned the puppet to its original position and went back to bed, though sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became commonplace. Objects were inexplicably moved, and she often felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she noticed the puppet sitting at the kitchen table, its glassy eyes fixed on her. Fear gnawed at her, but she couldn't bring herself to dispose of the puppet. Instead, she locked it in a trunk and shoved it into the attic, hoping to rid herself of the growing dread that had taken residence in her heart. That night, she was awakened by a soft, melodic humming. The tune was hauntingly familiar, yet she couldn't place it. She followed the sound to the attic door, which stood ajar. With trembling hands, she ascended the stairs. The trunk was open, and the puppet was gone. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the house, but there was no sign of it. Exhausted and terrified, she collapsed onto her bed, clutching a kitchen knife for protection. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, Sophie felt a cold, tiny hand brush against her cheek. She screamed, bolting upright, but there was nothing there. The bedroom door creaked open, and she could hear the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. Determined to end the nightmare, Sophie decided to confront the shopkeeper. She returned to the thrift store, but to her astonishment, it was boarded up, as if it had been abandoned for years. Confusion and fear clouded her mind as she stumbled back to her car. As she drove home, she noticed the puppet sitting in the passenger seat, its head turned toward her, a sinister smile etched onto its wooden face. Her heart raced and she swerved off the road, the car coming to a halt in a ditch. Gasping for breath, she turned to confront the puppet, but it was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she was trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to escape the puppet's malevolent presence. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie's life unraveled. She isolated herself, fearing the puppet's return. Sleep was a distant memory, and her once vibrant spirit was now a hollow shell. One stormy night, as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rumbled in the distance, Sophie heard a familiar humming. It was the same haunting melody that had tormented her before. She followed the sound to her bedroom, where the puppet sat on her bed, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice breaking. The puppet's mouth moved and a raspy voice filled the room. "You brought me into your home, Sophie. Now I am a part of you." Horror washed over her as she realized the truth. The puppet was not just a lifeless object, it was a vessel for something far more sinister. And by inviting it into her home, she had unknowingly allowed it to possess her.